U.S. History, an OpenStax textbook. Read along with the full text at www.openstax.org. You can find this audiobook anywhere you listen to podcasts, including Spotify, YouTube, Apple Podcasts, and more. Chapter 20, Politics in the Gilded Age, 1870 to 1900.
Introduction.
L. Frank Baum was a journalist who rose to prominence at the end of the 19th century. Baum's most famous story, The Wizard of Oz, was published in 1900, but Oz first came into being years earlier when he told a story to a group of schoolchildren visiting his newspaper office in South Dakota. He made up a tale of a wonderful land, and, searching for a name, he allegedly glanced down at his file cabinet, where the bottom drawer was labeled OZ. Thus was born the world of Oz, where a girl from struggling Kansas hoped to get help from a wonderful wizard who proved to be a fraud. Since then, many have speculated that the story reflected Baum's political sympathies for the Populist Party, which galvanized Midwestern and Southern farmers' demands for federal reform. Whether he intended the story to act as an allegory for the plight of farmers and workers in late 19th century America, or whether he simply wanted to write an American fairy tale set in the heartland, populists looked for answers much like Dorothy did. And the government in Washington proved to be meek rather than magical.
(20.1) Political Corruption in Postbellum America. Learning Objectives. By the end of this section, you will be able to discuss the national political scene during the Gilded Age, analyze why many critics considered the Gilded Age a period of ineffective national leadership.
The challenges Americans faced in the post-Civil War era extended far beyond the issue of Reconstruction and the challenge of an economy without slavery. Political and social repair of the nation was paramount, as was the correlative question of race relations in the wake of slavery. In addition, farmers faced the task of cultivating arid Western soils and selling crops in an increasingly global commodities market, while workers in urban industries suffered long hours and hazardous conditions at stagnant wages. Farmers, who still composed the largest percentage of the U.S. population, faced mounting debts as agricultural prices spiraled downward. These lower prices were due in large part to the cultivation of more acreage using more productive farming tools and machinery, global market competition, as well as price manipulation by commodity traders, exorbitant railroad freight rates, and costly loans upon which farmers depended. For many, their hard work resulted merely in a continuing decline in prices and even greater debt. These farmers, and others who sought leaders to heal the wounds left from the Civil War, organized in different states, and eventually into a national third-party challenge, only to find that, with the end of Reconstruction, federal political power was stuck in a permanent partisan stalemate, and corruption was widespread at both the state and federal levels. As the Gilded Age unfolded, presidents had very little power, due in large part to highly contested elections in which relative popular majorities were razor-thin. 2 presidents won the Electoral College without a popular majority. Further undermining their efficacy was a Congress comprising mostly politicians operating on the principle of political patronage. Eventually, frustrated by the lack of leadership in Washington, some Americans began to develop their own solutions, including the establishment of new political parties and organizations to directly address the problems they faced. Out of the frustration wrought by war and presidential political impotence, as well as an overwhelming pace of industrial change, farmers and workers formed a new grassroots reform movement that, at the end of the century, was eclipsed by an even larger, mostly middle-class, progressive movement. These reform efforts did bring about change, but not without a fight. The Gilded Age. Mark Twain coined the phrase Gilded Age in a book he co-authored with Charles Dudley Warner in 1873, The Gilded Age, A Tale of Today. The book satirized the corruption of post-Civil War society and politics. Indeed, popular excitement over national growth and industrialization only thinly glossed over the stark economic inequalities and various degrees of corruption of the era. Politicians of the time largely catered to business interests in exchange for political support and wealth. Many participated in graft and bribery, often justifying their actions with the excuse that corruption was too widespread for a successful politician to resist. The machine politics of the cities, specifically Tammany Hall in New York, illustrate the kind of corrupt but effective local and national politics that dominated the era. Nationally, between 1872 and 1896, the lack of clear popular mandates made presidents reluctant to venture beyond the interest of their traditional supporters. As a result, for nearly a quarter of a century, presidents had a weak hold on power, and legislators were reluctant to tie their political agendas to such weak leaders. On the contrary, weakened presidents were more susceptible to support various legislators' and lobbyists' agendas, as they owed tremendous favors to their political parties, as well as to key financial contributors, who helped them garner just enough votes to squeak into office through the Electoral College. As a result of this relationship, the rare pieces of legislation passed were largely responses to the desires of businessmen and industrialists whose support helped build politicians' careers. What was the result of this political malaise? Not surprisingly, almost nothing was accomplished on the federal level. However, problems associated with the tremendous economic growth during this time continued to mount. More Americans were moving to urban centers, which were unable to accommodate the massive numbers of working poor. Tenement houses with inadequate sanitation led to widespread illness. In rural parts of the country, people fared no better. Farmers were unable to cope with the challenges of low prices for their crops and exorbitant costs for everyday goods. All around the country, Americans in need of solutions turned further away from the federal government for help, leading to the rise of fractured and corrupt political groups.
Defining American, Mark Twain and the Gilded Age. Mark Twain wrote The Gilded Age, A Tale of Today, with his neighbor Charles Dudley Warner, as a satire about the corrupt politics and lust for power that he felt characterized American society at the time. The book, the only novel Twain ever co-authored, tells of the characters' desire to sell their land to the federal government and become rich. It takes aim at both the government in Washington and those Americans, in the South and elsewhere, whose lust for money and status among the newly rich in the nation's capital leads them to corrupt and foolish choices. In the following conversation from Chapter 51 of the book, Colonel Sellers instructs young Washington Hawkins on the routine practices of Congress.
Now let's figure up a little on the preliminaries. I think Congress always tries to do as near right as it can, according to its lights. A man can't ask any fairer than that. The first preliminary it always starts out on is to clean itself, so to speak. It will arraign 2 or 3 dozen of its members, or maybe 4 or 5 dozen, for taking bribes to vote for this and that and the other bill last winter.
It goes up into the dozens, does it?
Well, yes, in a free country like ours, where any man can run for Congress and anybody can vote for him, you can't expect immortal purity all the time. It ain't in nature. 60 or 80 or 150 people are bound to get in who are not angels in disguise, as young Hicks, the correspondent, says, but still it is a very good average, very good indeed. Well, after they have finished the bribery cases, they will take up cases of members who have bought their seats with money. That will take another 4 weeks.
Very good. Go on. You have accounted for 2/3 of the session.
Next, they will try each other for various smaller irregularities, like the sale of appointments to West Point cadetships and that sort of thing.
How long does it take to disinfect itself of these minor impurities?
Well, about 2 weeks generally.
So Congress always lies helpless in quarantine 10 weeks of a session. That's encouraging.
The book was a success, in part because it amused people even as it excoriated the politics of the day. For this humor, as well as its astute analysis, Twain and Warner's book still offers entertainment and insight today.
The election of 1876 sets the tone. In many ways, the presidential election of 1876 foreshadowed the politics of the era, in that it resulted in one of the most controversial results in all of presidential history. The country was in the middle of the economic downturn caused by the Panic of 1873, a downturn that would ultimately last until 1879, all but assuring that Republican incumbent Ulysses S. Grant would not be re-elected. Instead, the Republican Party nominated a three-time governor from Ohio, Rutherford B. Hayes. Hayes was a popular candidate who advocated for both hard money, an economy based upon gold currency transactions, to protect against inflationary pressures and civil service reform, that is, recruitment based upon merit and qualifications, which was to replace the practice of handing out government jobs as spoils. Most importantly, he had no significant political scandals in his past, unlike his predecessor Grant, who suffered through the Credit Mobilier of America scandal. In this most notorious example of Gilded Age corruption, several congressmen accepted cash and stock bribes in return for appropriating inflated federal funds for the construction of the Transcontinental Railroad. The Democrats likewise sought a candidate who could champion reform against growing political corruption. They found their man in Samuel J. Tilden, governor of New York and a self-made millionaire who had made a successful political career fighting corruption in New York City, including spearheading the prosecution against Tammany Hall boss William Tweed, who was later jailed. Both parties tapped into the popular mood of the day, each claiming to champion reform and promising an end to the corruption that had become rampant in Washington. Likewise, both parties promised an end to post-Civil War Reconstruction. The campaign was a typical one for the era. Democrats shone a spotlight on earlier Republican scandals, such as the Credit Mobilier affair, and Republicans relied upon the Bloody Shirt campaign, reminding the nation of the terrible human toll of the war against Southern Confederates who now reappeared in national politics under the mantle of the Democratic Party. President Grant previously had great success with the Bloody Shirt strategy in the 1868 election, when Republican supporters attacked Democratic candidate Horatio Seymour for his sympathy with New York City draft rioters during the war. In 1876, true to the campaign style of the day, neither Tilden nor Hayes actively campaigned for office, instead relying upon supporters and other groups to promote their causes. Fearing a significant African American and white Republican voter turnout in the South, particularly in the wake of the Civil Rights Act of 1875, which further empowered African Americans with protection in terms of public accommodations, Democrats relied upon white supremacist terror organizations to intimidate black people and Republicans. Tactics included physically assaulting many while they attempted to vote. The Red Shirts, based in Mississippi and the Carolinas, and the White League in Louisiana, relied upon intimidation tactics similar to the Ku Klux Klan, but operated in a more open and organized fashion with the sole goal of restoring Democrats to political predominance in the South. In several instances, Red Shirts would attack freedmen who attempted to vote, whipping them openly in the streets while simultaneously hosting barbecues to attract Democratic voters to the polls. Women throughout South Carolina began to sew red flannel shirts for the men to wear as a sign of their political views. Women themselves began wearing red ribbons in their hair and bows about their waists. The result of the presidential election ultimately was close. Tilden won the popular vote by nearly 300,000 votes. However, he had only 184 electoral votes, with 185 needed to proclaim formal victory. 3 states, Florida, Louisiana, and South Carolina, were in dispute due to widespread charges of voter fraud and miscounting. Questions regarding the validity of one of the 3 electors in Oregon cast further doubt on the final vote. However, that state subsequently presented evidence to Congress confirming all 3 electoral votes for Hayes. As a result of the disputed election, the House of Representatives established a special electoral commission to determine which candidate won the challenged electoral votes of these 3 states. In what later became known as the Compromise of 1877, Republican Party leaders offered Southern Democrats an enticing deal. The offer was that if the commission found in favor of a Hayes victory, Hayes would order the withdrawal of the remaining U.S. troops from those 3 Southern states, thus allowing the collapse of the radical Reconstruction governments of the immediate post-Civil War era. This move would permit Southern Democrats to end federal intervention and control their own state's fates in the wake of the end of slavery. After weeks of deliberation, the Electoral Commission voted 8-7 along straight party lines, declaring Hayes the victor in each of the 3 disputed states. As a result, Hayes defeated Tilden in the electoral vote by a count of 185 to 184 and became the next president. By April of that year, radical Reconstruction ended as promised, with the removal of federal troops from the final 2 Reconstruction states, South Carolina and Louisiana. Within a year, Redeemers, largely Southern Democrats, had regained control of the political and social fabric of the South. Although unpopular among the voting electorate, especially among African Americans who referred to it as the Great Betrayal, the compromise exposed the willingness of the 2 major political parties to avoid a standoff via a Southern Democrat filibuster, which would have greatly prolonged the final decision regarding the election. Democrats were largely satisfied to end Reconstruction and maintain home rule in the South in exchange for control over the White House. Likewise, most realized that Hayes would likely be a one-term president at best and prove to be as ineffectual as his pre-Civil War predecessors. Perhaps most surprising was the lack of even greater public outrage over such a transparent compromise, indicative of the little that Americans expected of their national government. In an era where voter turnout remained relatively high, the 2 major political parties remained largely indistinguishable in their agendas, as well as their propensity for questionable tactics and backroom deals. Likewise, a growing belief in laissez-faire principles as opposed to reforms and government intervention, which many Americans believed contributed to the outbreak of the Civil War, led even more Americans to accept the nature of an inactive federal government.
(20.2) The key political issues: patronage, tariffs, and gold. Learning objectives. By the end of this section, you will be able to explain the difference between the spoils system and civil service, and discuss the importance of this issue in the period from 1872 to 1896. Recognize the ways in which the issue of tariffs impacted different sectors of the economy in late 19th century America. Explain why Americans were split on the issue of a national gold standard versus free coinage of silver. Explain why political patronage was a key issue for political parties in the late 19th century.
Although Hayes's questionable ascendancy to the presidency did not create political corruption in the nation's capital, it did set the stage for politically motivated agendas and widespread inefficiency in the White House for the next 24 years. Weak president after weak president took office, and, as mentioned above, not one incumbent was re-elected. The Populists, it seemed, preferred the devil they didn't know to the one they did. Once elected, presidents had barely enough power to repay the political favors they owed to the individuals who ensured their narrow victories in cities and regions around the country. Their 4 years in office were spent repaying favors and managing the powerful relationships that put them in the White House. Everyday Americans were largely left on their own. Among the few political issues that presidents routinely addressed during this era were ones of patronage, tariffs, and the nation's monetary system. Patronage. the spoils system versus civil service. At the heart of each president's administration was the protection of the spoils system, that is, the power of the president to practice widespread political patronage. Patronage, in this case, took the form of the president naming his friends and supporters to various political posts. Given the close calls in presidential elections during the era, the maintenance of political machinery and repaying favors with patronage was important to all presidents, regardless of party affiliation. This had been the case since the advent of a two-party political system and universal male suffrage in the Jacksonian era. For example, upon assuming office in March 1829, President Jackson immediately swept employees from over 900 political offices, amounting to 10% of all federal appointments. Among the hardest hit was the U.S. Postal Service, which saw Jackson appoint his supporters and closest friends to over 400 positions in the service. As can be seen in the table 20.1, every single president elected from 1876 through 1892 won, despite receiving less than 50% of the popular vote. This established a repetitive cycle of relatively weak presidents who owed many political favors, which could be repaid through one prerogative power: patronage. As a result, the spoils system allowed those with political influence to ascend to powerful positions within the government, regardless of their level of experience or skill, thus compounding both the inefficiency of government as well as enhancing the opportunities for corruption. At the same time, a movement emerged in support of reforming the practice of political appointments. As early as 1872, civil service reformers gathered to create the Liberal Republican Party in an effort to unseat incumbent President Grant. Led by several Midwestern Republican leaders and newspaper editors, this party provided the impetus for other reform-minded Republicans to break free from the party and actually join the Democratic Party ranks. With newspaper editor Horace Greeley as their candidate, the party called for a thorough reform of the civil service as one of the most pressing necessities facing the nation. Although easily defeated in the election that followed, the work of the Liberal Republican Party set the stage for an even stronger push for patronage reform. Clearly owing favors to his Republican handlers for his surprise compromise victory by the slimmest of margins in 1876, President Hayes was ill-prepared to heed those cries for reform, despite his own stated preference for a new civil service system. In fact, he accomplished little during his 4 years in office other than granting favors, as dictated by Republican Party handlers. Two powerful Republican leaders attempted to control the president. The first was Roscoe Conkling, Republican senator from New York and leader of the Stalwarts, a group that strongly supported continuation of the current spoils system. Long supporting former President Grant, Conkling had no sympathy for some of Hayes's early appeals for civil service reform. The other was James G. Blaine, Republican senator from Maine and leader of the Half-Breeds. The Half-Breeds, who received their derogatory nickname from stalwart supporters, who considered Blaine's group to be only half Republican, advocated for some measure of civil service reform. With his efforts towards ensuring African American civil rights stymied by a Democratic Congress, and his decision to halt the coinage of silver, merely adding to the pressures of the economic panic of 1873, Hayes failed to achieve any significant legislation during his presidency. However, he did make a few overtures towards civil service reform. First, he adopted a new patronage rule, which held that a person appointed to an office could be dismissed only in the interest of efficient government operation, but not for overtly political reasons. Second, he declared that party leaders could have no official say in political appointments, although Conkling sought to continue his influence. Finally, he decided that government appointees were ineligible to manage campaign elections. Although not sweeping reforms, these were steps in a civil service direction. Hayes's first target in his meager reform effort was to remove Chester A. Arthur, a strong Conkling man, from his post as head of the New York City Customs House. Arthur had been notorious for using his post as customs collector to gain political favors for Conkling. When Hayes forcibly removed him from the position, even half-breeds questioned the wisdom of the move and began to distance themselves from Hayes. The loss of his meager public support due to the Compromise of 1877 and the declining congressional faction together sealed Hayes' fate and made his re-election impossible. An assassin's bullet sets the stage for civil service reform. In the wake of President Hayes's failure, Republicans began to battle over a successor for the 1880 presidential election. Initially, stalwarts favored Grant's return to the White House, while half-breeds promoted their leader, James Blaine. Following an expected convention deadlock, both factions agreed to a compromise presidential candidate, Senator James A. Garfield of Ohio, with Chester Arthur as his vice presidential running mate. The Democratic Party turned to Winfield Scott Hancock, a former Union commander who was a hero of the Battle of Gettysburg, as their candidate. Garfield won a narrow victory over Hancock by 40,000 votes, although he still did not win a majority of the popular vote. But less than 4 months into his presidency, events pushed civil service reform on the fast track. On July 2, 1881, Charles Guiteau shot and killed Garfield, allegedly uttering at the time, "I am a stalwart of stalwarts." Guiteau himself had wanted to be rewarded for his political support. He had written a speech for the Garfield campaign with an ambassadorship to France. His actions at the time were largely blamed on the spoils system, prompting more urgent cries for change. Surprising both his party and the Democrats when he assumed the office of president, Chester Arthur immediately distanced himself from the stalwarts. Although previously a loyal party man, Arthur understood that he owed his current position to no particular faction or favor. He was in the unique position to usher in a wave of civil service reform unlike any other political candidate, and he chose to do just that. In 1883, he signed into law the Pendleton Civil Service Act, the first significant piece of anti-patronage legislation. This law created the Civil Service Commission, which listed all government patronage jobs, and then set aside approximately 10% of the list as appointments to be determined through a competitive civil service examination process. Furthermore, to prevent future presidents from undoing this reform, the law declared that future presidents could enlarge the list but could never shrink it by moving a civil service job back into the patronage column.
Defining American. The assassination of a president.
I executed the divine command, and Garfield did remove to save my party and my country from the bitter fate of war. Charles Guiteau.
Charles Guiteau was a lawyer and supporter of the Republican Party, although not particularly well known in either area. But he gave a few speeches to modest crowds in support of the Republican nominee James Garfield, and ultimately deluded himself that his speeches influenced the country enough to cause Garfield's victory. After the election, Guiteau immediately began pressuring the new president, requesting a post as ambassador. When his queries went unanswered, Guiteau, out of money and angry that his supposed help had been ignored, planned to kill the president. He spent significant time planning his attack and considered weapons as diverse as dynamite and a stiletto before deciding on a gun, stating, "I wanted it done in an American manner." He followed the president around the Capitol and let several opportunities pass, unwilling to kill Garfield in front of his wife or son. Frustrated with himself, Guiteau recommitted to the plan and wrote a letter to the White House, explaining how this act would unite the Republican Party and save the Republic. Guiteau shot the president from behind and continued to shoot until police grabbed him and hauled him away. He went to jail, and the following November, after Garfield had died, he stood trial for murder. His poor mental health, which had been evident for some time, led to eccentric courtroom behavior that the newspapers eagerly reported and the public loved. He defended his case with a poem that used religious imagery and suggested that God had ordered him to commit the murder. He defended himself in court by saying, "The doctors killed Garfield, I just shot him." While this in fact was true, it did not save him. Guiteau was convicted and hanged in the summer of 1882.
Tariffs in the Gilded Age. In addition to civil service, President Arthur also carried the reformist spirit into the realm of tariffs, or taxes on international imports to the United States. Tariffs had long been a controversial topic in the United States, especially as the 19th century came to a close. Legislators appeared to be bending to the will of big businessmen who desired higher tariffs in order to force Americans to buy their domestically produced goods rather than higher-priced imports. Lower tariffs, on the other hand, would reduce prices and lower the average American's cost of living, and were therefore favored by many working-class families and farmers, to the extent that any of them fully understood such economic forces beyond the prices they paid at stores. Out of growing concern for the latter group, Arthur created the U.S. Tariff Commission in 1882 to investigate the propriety of increasingly high tariffs. Despite his concern, along with the Commission's recommendation for a 25% rollback in most tariffs, the most Arthur could accomplish was the Mongrel Tariff of 1883, which lowered tariff rates by barely 5%. Such bold attempts at reform further convinced Republican Party leaders, as the 1884 election approached, that Arthur was not their best option to continue in the White House. Arthur quickly found himself a man without a party. As the 1884 election neared, the Republican Party again searched their ranks for a candidate who could restore some semblance of the spoils system while maintaining a reformist image. Unable to find such a man, the predominant half-breeds again turned to their own leader, Senator Blaine. However, when news of his many personal corrupt bargains began to surface, a significant portion of the party chose to break from the traditional stalwarts versus half-breeds debate and form their own faction, the Mugwumps, a name taken from the Algonquin phrase for Great Chief. Anxious to capitalize on the disarray within the Republican Party, as well as to return to the White House for the first time in nearly 30 years, the Democratic Party chose to court the Mugwump vote by nominating Grover Cleveland, the reform governor from New York, who had built a reputation by attacking machine politics in New York City. Despite several personal charges against him for having fathered a child out of wedlock, Cleveland managed to hold on for a close victory with a margin of less than 30,000 votes. Cleveland's record on civil service reform added little to the initial blows struck by President Arthur. After electing the first Democratic president since 1856, the Democrats could actually make great use of the spoils system. Cleveland was, however, a notable reform president in terms of business regulation and tariffs. When the U.S. Supreme Court ruled in 1886 that individual states could not regulate interstate transportation, Cleveland urged Congress to pass the Interstate Commerce Act of 1887. Among several other powers, this law created the Interstate Commerce Commission, ICC, to oversee railroad prices and ensure that they remained reasonable to all customers. This was an important shift. In the past, railroads had granted special rebates to big businesses, such as John D. Rockefeller's Standard Oil, while charging small farmers with little economic muscle exorbitant rates. Although the act eventually provided for real regulation of the railroad industry, initial progress was slow due to the lack of enforcement power held by the ICC. Despite its early efforts to regulate railroad rates, the U.S. Supreme Court undermined the commission in Interstate Commerce Commission v. Cincinnati, New Orleans, and Texas Pacific Railway Company in 1897. Rate regulations were limits on profits that, in the opinion of a majority of the justices, violated the 14th Amendment protection against depriving persons of their property without due process of the law. As for tariff reform, Cleveland agreed with Arthur's position that tariffs remained far too high and were clearly designed to protect big domestic industries at the expense of average consumers who could benefit from international competition. While the general public applauded Cleveland's efforts at both civil service and tariff reform, influential businessmen and industrialists remained adamant that the next president must restore the protective tariffs at all costs. To counter the Democrats' renomination of Cleveland, the Republican Party turned to Benjamin Harrison, grandson of former President William Henry Harrison. Although Cleveland narrowly won the overall popular vote, Harrison rode the influential coattails of several businessmen and party bosses to win the key electoral states of New York and New Jersey, where party officials stressed Harrison's support for a higher tariff and thus secure the White House. Not surprisingly, after Harrison's victory, the United States witnessed a brief return to higher tariffs and a strengthening of the spoils system. In fact, the McKinley tariff raised some rates as much as 50%, which was the highest tariff in American history to date. Some of Harrison's policies were intended to offer relief to average Americans struggling with high costs and low wages, but remained largely ineffective. First, the Sherman Antitrust Act of 1890 sought to prohibit business monopolies as conspiracies and restraint of trade, but it was seldom enforced during the first decade of its existence. Second, the Sherman Silver Purchase Act of the same year required the U.S. Treasury to mint over 4 million ounces of silver into coins each month to circulate more cash into the economy, raise prices for farm goods, and help farmers pay their way out of debt. But the measure could not undo the previous hard money policies that had deflated prices and pulled farmers into well-entrenched cycles of debt. Other measures proposed by Harrison intended to support African Americans, including a force bill to protect voters in the South, as well as an education bill designed to support public education and improve literacy rates among African Americans, also met with defeat. Monetary policies and the issue of gold versus silver. Although political corruption, the spoils system, and the question of tariff rates were popular discussions of the day, none were more relevant to working-class Americans and farmers than the issue of the nation's monetary policy and the ongoing debate of gold versus silver. There had been frequent attempts to establish a bimetallic standard, which in turn would have created inflationary pressures and placed more money into circulation that could have subsequently benefited farmers. But the government remained committed to the gold standard, including the official demonetizing of silver altogether in 1873. Such a stance greatly benefited prominent businessmen engaged in foreign trade while forcing more farmers and working-class Americans into greater debt. As farmers and working-class Americans sought the means by which to pay their bills and other living expenses, especially in the wake of increased tariffs as the century came to a close, many saw adherence to a strict gold standard as their most pressing problem. With limited gold reserves, the money supply remained constrained. At a minimum, a return to a bimetallic policy that would include the production of silver dollars would provide some relief. However, the aforementioned Sherman Silver Purchase Act was largely ineffective to combat the growing debts that many Americans faced. Under the law, the federal government purchased 4.5 million ounces of silver on a monthly basis in order to mint silver dollars. However, many investors exchanged the banknotes with which the government purchased the silver for gold, thus severely depleting the nation's gold reserve. Fearing the latter, President Grover Cleveland signed the Act's repeal in 1893. This lack of meaningful monetary measures from the federal government would lead one group in particular who required such assistance, American farmers, to attempt to take control over the political process itself.
.3 Farmers' Revolt in the Populist Era. Learning Objectives. By the end of this section, you will be able to understand how the economic and political climate of the day promoted the formation of the farmers' protest movement in the latter half of the 19th century. Explain how the farmers' revolt moved from protest to politics.
The challenges that many American farmers faced in the last quarter of the 19th century were significant. They contended with economic hardships born out of rapidly declining farm prices, prohibitively high tariffs on items they needed to purchase, and foreign competition. One of the largest challenges they faced was overproduction, where the glut of their products in the marketplace drove the price lower and lower. Overproduction of crops occurred in part due to the westward expansion of homestead farms, and in part because industrialization led to new farm tools that dramatically increased crop yields. As farmers fell deeper into debt, whether it be to the local stores where they bought supplies or to the railroads that shipped their produce, their response was to increase crop production each year in the hope of earning more money with which to pay back their debt. The more they produced, the lower prices dropped. To a hard-working farmer, the notion that their own overproduction was the greatest contributing factor to their debt was a completely foreign concept. In addition to the cycle of overproduction, tariffs were a serious problem for farmers. Rising tariffs on industrial products made purchased items more expensive, yet tariffs were not being used to keep farm prices artificially high as well. Therefore, farmers were paying inflated prices, but not receiving them. Finally, the issue of gold versus silver as the basis of U.S. currency was a very real problem to many farmers. Farmers needed more money in circulation, whether it was paper or silver, in order to create inflationary pressure. Inflationary pressure would allow farm prices to increase, thus allowing them to earn more money that they could then spend on the higher-priced goods in stores. However, in 1888, federal law set the amount of paper money in circulation, and, as mentioned above, Harrison's Sherman-Silver Act, intended to increase the amount of silver coinage, was too modest to do any real good, especially in light of the unintended consequence of depleting the nation's gold reserve. In short, farmers had a big stack of bills and wanted a big stack of money, be it paper or silver, to pay them. Neither was forthcoming from a government that cared more about issues of patronage and how to stay in the White House for more than 4 years at a time. Farmers begin to organize. The initial response by increasingly frustrated and angry farmers was to organize into groups that were similar to early labor unions. Taking note of how the industrial labor movement had unfolded in the last quarter of the century, farmers began to understand that a collective voice could create significant pressure among political leaders and produce substantive change. While farmers had their own challenges, including that of geography and diverse needs among different types of farmers, they believed this model to be useful to their cause. One of the first efforts to organize farmers came in 1867 with Oliver Hudson Kelley's creation of the Patrons of Husbandry, more popularly known as the Grange. In the wake of the Civil War, the Grangers quickly grew to over 1.5 million members in less than a decade. Kelley believed that farmers could best help themselves by creating farmers' cooperatives in which they could pool resources and obtain better shipping rates, as well as prices on seeds, fertilizer, machinery, and other necessary inputs. These cooperatives, he believed, would let them self-regulate production as well as collectively obtain better rates from railroad companies and other businesses. At the state level, specifically in Wisconsin, Minnesota, Illinois, and Iowa, the Patrons of Husbandry did briefly succeed in urging the passage of Granger laws, which regulated some railroad rates along with the prices charged by grain elevator operators. The movement also created a political party, the Greenback Party, so named for its support of print currency, or greenbacks, not based upon a gold standard, which saw brief success with the election of 15 congressmen. However, such successes were short-lived and had little impact on the lives of everyday farmers. In the Wabash case of 1886, brought by the Wabash, St. Louis, and Pacific Railroad Company, the U.S. Supreme Court ruled against the state of Illinois for passing Granger laws controlling railroad rates. The court found such laws to be unconstitutional. Their argument held that states did not have the authority to control interstate commerce. As for the Greenback Party, when only 7 delegates appeared at an 1888 national convention of the group, the party faded from existence. The Farmers' Alliance, a conglomeration of 3 regional alliances formed in the mid-1880s, took root in the wake of the Grange movement. In 1890, Dr. Charles McCune, who led the Southern Alliance, which was based in Texas and had over 100,000 members by 1886, urged the creation of a national alliance between his organization, the Northwest Alliance, and the Colored Alliance, the largest African American organization in the United States. Led by Tom Watson, the Colored Alliance, which was founded in Texas but quickly spread throughout the Old South, counted over 1 million members. Although they originally advocated for self-help, African Americans in the group soon understood the benefits of political organization and a unified voice to improve their plight, regardless of race. While racism kept the alliance splintered among the 3 component branches, they still managed to craft a national agenda that appealed to their large membership. All told, the Farmers' Alliance brought together over 2.5 million members, 1.5 million white and 1 million black. The Alliance movement, and the subsequent political party that emerged from it, also featured prominent roles for women. Nearly 250,000 women joined the movement due to their shared interest in the farmers' worsening situation, as well as the promise of being a full partner with political rights within the group, which they saw as an important step towards advocacy for women's suffrage on a national level. The ability to vote and stand for office within the organization encouraged many women who sought similar rights on the larger American political scene. Prominent Alliance spokeswoman Mary Elizabeth Lease of Kansas often spoke of membership in the Farmers' Alliance as an opportunity to raise less corn and more hell. The Alliance movement had several goals similar to those of the original Grange, including greater regulation of railroad prices and the creation of an inflationary national monetary policy. However, most creative among the solutions promoted by the Farmers' Alliance was the call for a sub-treasury plan. Under this plan, the federal government would store farmers' crops in government warehouses for a brief period of time, during which the government would provide loans to farmers worth 80% of the current crop prices. Thus, farmers would have immediate cash on hand with which to settle debts and purchase goods, while their crops sat in warehouses and farm prices increased due to this control over supply at the market. When market prices rose sufficiently high enough, the farmer could withdraw his crops, sell at the higher price, repay the government loan, and still have profit remaining. Economists of the day thought the plan had some merit. In fact, a greatly altered version would subsequently be adopted during the Great Depression of the 1930s in the form of the Agricultural Adjustment Act. However, the federal government never seriously considered the plan, as congressmen questioned the propriety of the government serving as a rural creditor making loans to farmers with no assurance that production controls would result in higher commodity prices. The government's refusal to act on the proposal left many farmers wondering what it would take to find solutions to their growing indebtedness. From organization to political party. Angry at the federal government's continued unwillingness to substantively address the plight of the average farmer, Charles McCune and the Farmers' Alliance chose to create a political party whose representatives, if elected, could enact real change. Put simply, if the government would not address the problem, then it was time to change those elected to power. In 1891, the Alliance formed the Populist Party, or People's Party, as it was more widely known. Beginning with non-presidential year elections, the Populist Party had modest success, particularly in Kansas, Nebraska, and the Dakotas, where they succeeded in electing several state legislators, one governor, and a handful of congressmen. As the 1892 presidential election approached, the Populists chose to model themselves after the Democratic and Republican parties in the hope that they could shock the country with a third-party victory. At their national convention that summer in Omaha, Nebraska, they wrote the Omaha Platform to more fully explain to all Americans the goals of the new party. Written by Ignatius Donnelly, the platform statement vilified railroad owners, bankers, and big businessmen as all being part of a widespread conspiracy to control farmers. As for policy changes, the platform called for adoption of the sub-treasury plan, government control over railroads, an end to the national bank system, the creation of a federal income tax, the direct election of U.S. senators, and several other measures, all of which aimed at a more proactive federal government that would support the economic and social welfare of all Americans. At the close of the convention, the party nominated James B. Weaver as its presidential candidate. In a rematch of the 1888 election, the Democrats again nominated Grover Cleveland, while Republicans went with Benjamin Harrison. Despite the presence of a third-party challenger, Cleveland won another close popular vote to become the first U.S. president to be elected to non-consecutive terms. Although he finished a distant third, populist candidate Weaver polled a respectable 1 million votes. Rather than being disappointed, several populists applauded their showing, especially for a third party with barely 2 years of national political experience under its belt. They anxiously awaited the 1896 election, believing that if the rest of the country, in particular industrial workers, experienced hardships similar to those that farmers already faced, a powerful alliance among the two groups could carry the populace to victory.
.4 Social and labor unrest in the 1890s. Learning objectives. By the end of this section, you will be able to explain how the Depression of 1893 helped the Populist Party to grow in popularity in the 1890s. Understand the forces that contributed to the Populist Party's decline following the 1896 presidential election.
Insofar as farmers wanted the rest of the country to share their plight, they got their wish. Soon after Cleveland's election, the nation catapulted into the worst economic depression in its history to date. As the government continued to fail in its efforts to address the growing problems, more and more Americans sought relief outside of the traditional two-party system. To many industrial workers, the Populist Party began to seem like a viable solution. From farmers' hardships to a national depression. The late 1880s and early 1890s saw the American economy slide precipitously. As mentioned above, farmers were already struggling with economic woes, and the rest of the country followed quickly. Following a brief rebound from the speculation-induced panic of 1873, in which bank investments in railroad bonds spread the nation's financial resources too thin, a rebound due in large part to the protective tariffs of the 1880s, a greater economic catastrophe hit the nation as the decade of the 1890s began to unfold. The causes of the Depression of 1893 were manifold, but one major element was the speculation in railroads over the previous decades. The rapid proliferation of railroad lines created a false impression of growth for the economy as a whole. Banks and investors fed the growth of the railroads with fast-paced investment in industry and related businesses, not realizing that the growth they were following was built on a bubble. When the railroads began to fail due to expenses outpacing returns on their construction, the supporting businesses, from banks to steel mills, failed also. Beginning with the closure of the Philadelphia and Reading Railroad Company in 1893, several railroads ceased their operations as a result of investors cashing in their bonds, thus creating a ripple effect throughout the economy. In a single year, from 1893 to 1894, unemployment estimates increased from 3% to nearly 19% of all working-class Americans. In some states, the unemployment rate soared even higher, over 35% in New York State and 43% in Michigan. At the height of this depression, over 3 million American workers were unemployed. By 1895, Americans living in cities grew accustomed to seeing the homeless on the streets or lining up at soup kitchens. Immediately following the economic downturn, people sought relief through their elected federal government. Just as quickly, they learned what farmers had been taught in the preceding decades. A weak, inefficient government interested solely in patronage, and the spoils system, in order to maintain its power, was in no position to help the American people face this challenge. The federal government had little in place to support those looking for work or to provide direct aid to those in need. Of course, to be fair, the government had seldom faced these questions before. Americans had to look elsewhere. A notable example of the government's failure to act was the story of Coxey's Army. In the spring of 1894, businessman Jacob Coxey led a march of unemployed Ohioans from Cincinnati to Washington, D.C., where leaders of the group urged Congress to pass public works legislation for the federal government to hire unemployed workers to build roads and other public projects. From the original 100 protesters, the march grew 500 strong as others joined along the route to the nation's capital. Upon their arrival, not only were their cries for federal relief ignored, but Coxey and several other marchers were arrested for trespassing on the grass outside the U.S. Capitol. Frustration over the event led many angry workers to consider supporting the Populist Party in subsequent elections. Several strikes also punctuated the growing depression, including a number of violent uprisings in the coal regions of Ohio and Pennsylvania. But the infamous Pullman strike of 1894 was most notable for its nationwide impact, as it all but shut down the nation's railroad system in the middle of the Depression. The strike began immediately on the heels of the Coxey's Army March when, in the summer of 1894, company owner George Pullman fired over 2,000 employees at Pullman Co., which made railroad cars, such as Pullman sleeper cars, and reduced the wages of the remaining 3,000 workers. Since the factory operated in the company town of Pullman, Illinois, where workers rented homes from George Pullman and shopped at the company store owned by him as well, unemployment also meant eviction. Facing such harsh treatment, all of the Pullman workers went on strike to protest the decisions. Eugene Freed Debs, head of the American Railway Union, led the strike. In order to bring the plight of Pullman, Illinois, to Americans all around the country, Debs adopted the strike strategy of ordering all American Railroad Union members to refuse to handle any train that had Pullman cars on it. Since virtually every train in the United States operated with Pullman cars, the strike truly brought the transportation industry to its knees. Fearful of his ability to end the economic depression, with such a vital piece of the economy at a standstill, President Cleveland turned to his Attorney General for the answer. The Attorney General proposed a solution: use federal troops to operate the trains under the pretense of protecting the delivery of the U.S. mail that was typically found on all trains. When Debs and the American Railway Union refused to obey the court injunction prohibiting interference with the mail, the troops began operating the trains, and the strike quickly ended. Debs himself was arrested, tried, convicted, and sentenced to 6 months in prison for disobeying the court injunction. The American Railway Union was destroyed, leaving workers even less empowered than before, and Debs was in prison, contemplating alternatives to a capitalist-based national economy. The Depression of 1893 left the country limping towards the next presidential election with few solutions in sight.
Americana. L. Frank Baum. Did Coxey's Army inspire Dorothy and the Wizard of Oz? Scholars, historians, and economists have long argued inconclusively that L. Frank Baum intended the story of The Wizard of Oz as an allegory for the politics of the day. Whether that actually was Baum's intention is up for debate, but certainly the story could be read as support for the Populist Party's crusade on behalf of American farmers. In 1894, Baum witnessed Coxey's army's march firsthand, and some feel it may have influenced the story. According to this theory, the scarecrow represents the American farmer, the Tin Woodman is the industrial worker, and the Cowardly Lion is William Jennings Bryan, a prominent Silverite, strong supporters of the Populist Party who advocated for the free coinage of silver, who, in 1900 when the book was published, was largely criticized by the Republicans as being cowardly and indecisive. In the story, the characters march towards Oz, much as Coxey's army marched to Washington. Like Dorothy and her companions, Coxey's army gets in trouble, before being turned away with no help. Following this reading, the seemingly powerful but ultimately impotent Wizard of Oz is a representation of the president, and Dorothy only finds happiness by wearing the silver slippers. They only became ruby slippers in the later movie version, along the yellow brick road, a reference to the need for the country to move from the gold standard to a two-metal silver and gold plan. While no literary theorists or historians have proven this connection to be true, it is possible that Coxey's army inspired Baum to create Dorothy's journey on the yellow brick road.
The election of 1896. As the final presidential election of the 1800s unfolded, all signs pointed to a possible populist victory. Not only had the ongoing economic depression convinced many Americans, farmers and factory workers alike, of the inability of either major political party to address the situation, but also the Populist Party, since the last election, benefited from 4 more years of experience and numerous local victories. As they prepared for their convention in St. Louis that summer, the Populists watched with keen interest as the Republicans and Democrats hosted their own conventions. The Republicans remained steadfast in their defense of a gold-based standard for the American economy, as well as high protective tariffs. They turned to William McKinley, former congressman and current governor of Ohio, as their candidate. At their convention, the Democrats turned to William Jennings Bryan, a congressman from Nebraska. Bryan defended the importance of a silver-based monetary system and urged the government to coin more silver. Furthermore, being from farm country, he was very familiar with the farmers' plight and saw some merit in the sub-treasury system proposal. In short, Bryan could have been the ideal populist candidate, but the Democrats got to him first. The Populist Party subsequently endorsed Bryan as well, with their party's nomination 3 weeks later. As the Populist convention unfolded, the delegates had an important decision to make: either locate another candidate, even though Bryan would have been an excellent choice, or join the Democrats and support Bryan as the best candidate, but risk losing their identity as a third political party as a result. The Populist Party chose the latter and endorsed Bryan's candidacy. However, they also nominated their own vice presidential candidate, Georgia Senator Tom Watson, as opposed to the Democratic nominee, Arthur Sewall, presumably in an attempt to maintain some semblance of a separate identity. The race was a heated one, with McKinley running a typical 19th-century-style front porch campaign, during which he espoused the long-held Republican Party principles to visitors who would call on him at his Ohio home. Bryan, to the contrary, delivered speeches all throughout the country, bringing his message to the people that Republicans shall not crucify mankind on a cross of gold. The result was a close election that finally saw a U.S. president win a majority of the popular vote for the first time in 24 years. McKinley defeated Bryan by a popular vote of 7.1 million to 6.5 million. Bryan's showing was impressive by any standard, as his popular vote total exceeded that of any other presidential candidate in American history to that date, winner or loser. He pulled nearly 1 million more votes than did the previous Democratic victor, Grover Cleveland. However, his campaign also served to split the Democratic vote, as some party members remained convinced of the propriety of the gold standard and supported McKinley in the election. Amid a growing national depression where Americans truly recognized the importance of a strong leader with sound economic policies, McKinley garnered nearly 2 million more votes than his Republican predecessor, Benjamin Harrison. Put simply, the American electorate was energized to elect a strong candidate who could adequately address the country's economic woes. Voter turnout was the largest in American history to that date. While both candidates benefited, McKinley did more so than Bryan. In the aftermath, it is easy to say that it was Bryan's defeat that all but ended the rise of the Populist Party. Populists had thrown their support to the Democrats, who shared similar ideas for the economic rebound of the country and lost. In choosing principle over distinct party identity, the Populists aligned themselves to the growing two-party American political system and would have difficulty maintaining party autonomy afterwards. Future efforts to establish a separate party identity would be met with ridicule by critics who would say that populists were merely Democrats in sheep's clothing. But other factors also contributed to the decline of populism at the close of the century. First, the discovery of vast gold deposits in Alaska during the Klondike Gold Rush of 1896 to 1899, also known as the Yukon Gold Rush, shored up the nation's weakening economy and made it possible to thrive on a gold standard. Second, the impending Spanish-American War, which began in 1898, further fueled the economy and increased demand for American farm products. Still, the populist spirit remained, although it lost some momentum at the close of the 19th century. As will be seen in a subsequent chapter, the reformist zeal took on new forms as the 20th century unfolded.
Defining American. William Jennings Bryan and the Cross of Gold. William Jennings Bryan was a politician and speechmaker in the late 19th century, and he was particularly well known for his impassioned argument that the country move to a bimetal or silver standard. He received the Democratic presidential nomination in 1896, and at the nominating convention, he gave his most famous speech. He sought to argue against Republicans who stated that the gold standard was the only way to ensure stability and prosperity for American businesses. In the speech, he said,
"We say to you that you have made the definition of a businessman too limited in its application. The man who is employed for wages is as much a businessman as his employer. The attorney in a country town is as much a businessman as the corporation counsel in a great metropolis. The merchant at the crossroads store is as much a businessman as the merchant of New York. The farmer who goes forth in the morning and toils all day, who begins in spring and toils all summer, and who, by the application of brain and muscle to the natural resources of the country, creates wealth, is as much a businessman as the man who goes upon the Board of Trade and bets upon the price of grain. We come to speak of this broader class of businessmen."
This defense of working Americans as critical to the prosperity of the country resonated with his listeners, as did his passionate ending when he stated, "Having behind us the producing masses of this nation and the world, supported by the commercial interests, the laboring interests, and the toilers everywhere, we will answer their demand for a gold standard by saying to them, 'You shall not press down upon the brow of labor this crown of thorns. You shall not crucify mankind upon a cross of gold.'" The speech was an enormous success and played a role in convincing the Populist Party that he was the candidate for them.
This has been U.S. History from OpenStax. OpenStax textbooks and this free audiobook are covered under a Creative Commons license. The full text is available at www.openstax.org. This project was made possible by CC Echo, the California Consortium for Equitable Change in Hispanic-Serving Institutions, Open Education Resources. You can learn more about CC Echo by visiting the link in this episode's show notes. You can find this audiobook anywhere you listen to podcasts, including Spotify, YouTube, Apple Podcasts, and more. Instructors can even download a course shell to embed these recordings in Canvas courses. Learn more by visiting www.openaudio.us. Did you find this audiobook helpful? If so, let us know by leaving a comment and sharing this recording with a colleague or a friend.